This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Ukraine, where pro-Russian groups have declared independence from Kiev following a hastily organized referendum on self-rule in two parts of eastern Ukraine. The referendum was held in the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, less than 2 months after residents in Crimea voted to secede from Ukraine. Roman Lagan served as the head of the de facto Electoral Commission for Sunday's referendum.
These results only mean that the people of Donbass demand their opinion be respected, the norms of international law be respected. We demand the right for self-determination, and we will strive towards this. We understand perfectly that no one in the world will recognize this. European organizations and countries in the whole world will not recognize it. But we would like to be listened to, and that is why we held this people's referendum organized by the people.
Earlier today, British Foreign Secretary William Hague dismissed the results of Sunday's referendum in eastern Ukraine.
These votes, these attempts at referendums have zero credibility in the eyes of the world. They are illegal by anybody's standards. They don't meet any standard, not a single standard of objectivity, transparency, fairness, or being properly conducted as a public referendum or election. And indeed, the people organizing them didn't really even pretend to meet any of those standards. The important thing is that the Ukrainian elections go ahead on the 25th of May.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that Moscow respects the results of the referendum, but he did not indicate any plans for Russia to annex eastern Ukraine like it annexed Crimea following a similar referendum in March.
We respect the will of the residents of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and we are of the position that practical implementation of the results of the vote will be carried out in a civilized way without repetition of violence through a dialogue between representatives of Kiev, Donetsk, and Luhansk.
To talk more about Ukraine and what Sunday's referendum will mean, we're joined by Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and at Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War, which is out in paperback. He recently co-wrote an article for The Nation with Katrina vanden Heuvel headlined Cold War Against Russia Without Debate. So the significance of this election, Professor Cohen.
Which one? The referendum yesterday?
The referendum yesterday.
Well, it's going to make relations between Moscow and the United States and Europe worse, but it shouldn't, because a bunch of people decided to have a referendum which is no more or less legal than the government in Kiev, which came to power from the street. What's interesting about it is that it went off with a minimum of violence, and it tells you that a lot of people down there want you know, we had a revolution where one slogan was no taxation without representation. They're saying no government, no governance without representation in Kiev. They want some form of home rule. It's not about joining Russia for the most part. I think no more than 17% in a poll said they'd like to join Russia. This is about having a voice in the future Ukrainian state.
Explain the referendum. In fact, it wasn't like Crimea when it said you want to become a part of Russia. This was about, it was vague.
It's less than vague. About 3 or 4 months ago, maybe a little less, in Donetsk, people who were unhappy, very political people, who were unhappy with Kiev government, formed something called the People's Autonomous Republic of Donetsk. Donetsk is an enormous province. It's where a lot of the heavy industry, a lot of the hub of the natural gas supplies lines to Europe go from Russia through Ukraine. It really is the industrial heartland of Ukraine. And they said, we're declaring home rule. They weren't elected, it just came from the street. Now they put on a referendum that says, do you approve of what we did? We created an autonomous republic. Do you approve of that? That's all it was. Now what they've said, and the guy you had, Roman, who was reporting from Ukraine, said, we don't know what we're going to do next. We might have another referendum. It may be about a federal constitution. It may be about joining Russia. We have to see what the people want. But you're right. All it's doing is saying, we now have in Donetsk and in Lugansk and in these areas of eastern Ukraine a government approved by the people, people who don't approve of the government in Kiev. Now, you could spin that into something very positive. if Washington wanted to push its client state in Kiev to that. It could say, okay, it's time to negotiate. Kiev should begin, instead of sending troops there, which it's been doing for the last 2 weeks, it should send a delegation to negotiate with these people who have been affirmed by the referendum, but that's not happening.
Can you talk about the violence? It was just outside of the city of Donetsk. Apparently, at least one pro-Russian demonstrator was killed when members of the National Guard seized control of City Hall in an apparent attempt to prevent the referendum from taking place there.
If you'll permit me, I don't think we can look at the death of that person, and I think there were more than that who died, outside the context of what has happened since the Kiev government. Now, let our viewers be clear. This Kiev government is the government that came to power without legality. You can accept it or not accept it, but it is the government that is embraced 100% by Washington and by Europe. It is our government. This government sent troops to eastern Ukraine. That's seems to be about 10, 15,000, maybe not that many, but tanks, armored personnel carrier, heavy artillery, with helicopters flying over. And they flew over these cities that we're discussing. Now remember, please, what happened in Odessa about 10 days ago. I trust your listeners and viewers will remember. 40 people were burned to death in a building. That's a horrific event. Then...
And who did that?
Well, let's come back to that. Then, a day or two after that, Ukrainian troops from Kiev entered the city, 500,000 people, right into the residential area where people live, with parks, with mothers and fathers with their kids strolling in the park, sent tanks and armored personnel carrier into that city and opened fire. All right. Put that together with Odessa. That's horrific. It doesn't matter who began that. It doesn't matter if two guys in the street after a soccer game began punching each other. What government sends tanks into a city when there's nothing happening in the city to provoke you? And here's the second part of the story, and personally this outrages me. I don't know how your viewers and listeners think. What did the United States government say? Did it say we regret the loss of life? Did it say there should be an investigation? No. It said Kiev has the right to restore law and order. Now, I would stretch this out. If a war crime was committed in Odessa by the burning of 40 people to death in a building, and by tanks entering the streets of Mariupol or any other city, if that's a war crime, we didn't commit it, but we applauded it. And there's something wrong there, no matter who's right and wrong in this dispute. And that, when the referendum took place, and you asked about the shooting, the Kiev government tried to intimidate people going to the votes by opening fire on some areas outside the city. They failed. The turnout was large. Not as large as the Autonomy people are claiming it was, but it was large.